Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. President-elect Donald Trump is in the process of forming his cabinet, particularly his foreign policy team. Is there a danger he will surround himself with neocons like Obama did? To CrossTalk Trump's foreign policy, I'm joined by my guest here in Moscow, Mark Sleboda. He's an international affairs and security analyst. We also have Alexander Mercouris. He's the editor-in-chief of theduran.com. And we also have Matthew Gordon Banks. He is a former senior research fellow at the Defense Academy of the United Kingdom and a former British MP. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Mark, if you look at Western mainstream media, particularly in the United States, Trump transition team in crisis. That's the message here. He has made some picks. What do you think so far?
Well, I wouldn't say that the team is in crisis.
I wouldn't either.
That's an exaggeration of a media that is looking for the first opportunity, of course, to continue the war against him that began in his campaign. But certainly, it is not as smooth as some transitions have been, in that I don't think that they necessarily expected to win any more than the rest of the country expected them to win. Certainly, there was a degree of uncertainty. And he did run a campaign within an extremely small team, largely of political amateurs, particularly his campaign chair, Bannon, who is now one of his chief strategists, and so on, Stephen Bannon. But of the picks that we've seen so far, what I don't see, I haven't seen a large numbers of what we can talk about as ideologically institutionalized neocons yet. But what we do see is a lot of right-wing figures, solidly right-wing figures.
It's really interesting. Yeah. One of the issues they all seem to have in common, and it's not Russia, it's Iran, and I want to talk about that later. You know, Alex, one of the biggest problems is that he's facing a party that has not completely embraced him yet. And I think this is one of the things that he's having to have to face, because there is talent out there. We see some of the neocon crowd changing their mind. They're fishing for a job here. It's going to be very, very difficult here, but he is making some progress. He's not in crisis at all. We have to remember that Bill Clinton, he made most of his cabinet decisions right before Christmas. So that's a month from now. Go ahead.
Yes, well, I think on balance, given how the fact that he actually ran against his party and that his party was opposed to him, the fact that they're sort of tiptoeing towards each other is interesting. And I think on balance, it's not happened as there isn't the crisis in the transition team that people are talking about. I think it's gone quite smoothly. But the great problem that Trump has is that the entire foreign policy establishment in the United States, Republican and Democrat, has for many years now been neocon. And that makes it very difficult for him to find people who he can
Matthew,
work
go
with.
ahead, jump in right there. This is really one of the biggest problems, because we have a uniparty when it comes to foreign policy. It seems to be quite a great deal of ideological cohesion here. And this is one of the problems he's facing here, because we don't have a debate in foreign policy, and Trump is facing that, and it's going to be a hard wall for him to crack.
Well, it's going to take time. The media can do what it wants. Yeah. It can expect what it wants. It can say what it wants. But he is clearly he's clearly not assumed anything. He's won. He's surprised many of us. He certainly surprised me when I woke up the following day after the election. I didn't stay up overnight, and I was surprised. But he's taking his time, I'm optimistic. Sure, some of these people are neocons. Some of them have a reputation. But I think, actually, the prospects for a Trump presidency are going to be rather better than we thought.
I'd like to think that, and all I would do is tell our viewers here is don't watch the mainstream media, and Trump might get a chance here. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, it's the page isn't written yet. We're still looking at a tabula rasa. And as Alex said very keenly, this is right now a war between Trump, largely himself, and a small circle of like-minded amateurs around him, and the GOP establishment and the neocons for Trump's foreign policy. and crucial decisions, particularly a Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, are coming. Such positions as Secretary of Labor, Education, these are the usual kinds of
political goodies,
cronyism, so on. They'll be appointed according to favoritism, domestic policy. These things aren't important, but these two crucial positions, Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, are wide open fields at this point still. Trump is considering a huge number of people.
Well, I have to wonder if he's going to pick somebody that's really, really strong, because he needs a strong Secretary of State, but he is a type of person that doesn't like to share the limelight a whole lot. It's going to be kind of difficult to find someone like that.
Trump's foreign policy, Trump has had he's flipped back and forth on a lot of policies, but his foreign policy is the most unique factor of his campaign. It didn't win him votes with his party's elite. It didn't win him vote with his party's base by and large.
And donors.
So that tells me that there is some honesty that he's looking for there, something that he real adheres to, and he's really going to have to fight for it. His choice.
Let's talk about Russia here, Alex. I mean, this is something that was different about the campaign, and Trump took a lot of knocks for it here. Now, I'll be honest. There's one thing I can hope for with U.S.-Russia relations, and one thing I can expect, and still expecting can be relatively optimistic. What I want to avoid is a conflict between the two countries. Other than that, let's negotiate here. So I have a limited wish list. What do you think?
The great problem is that Trump is one person. He may be the President of the United States, but he has to face an entire political system in the United States, which has been geared for a very long time now towards a confrontation with Russia. Can he turn it round? It's, I think, problematic. He will try. I think he will try, because I cannot see, like Mark, why he would have argued a case for a rapprochement with Russia in the election if he didn't actually believe it, given how difficult it was. But he's got to find people who will work with him to do that. Not easy to see them. Yep. He's got to get that policy through Congress.
He's going to have to be in charge. He's not going to be able to delegate here. Matthew, from a European perspective here, we again, if you look at the mainstream media, the jitters were NATO members and all of that. It's really quite interesting is that they want their dependency to continue on the United States. It's really remarkable because, well, first of all, they don't pay for much of their defense here. What I worry about is that some member countries, the Baltic states and Poland, will continue with this warmongering, scaremongering to keep the NATO alliance the way it is. It may be, I think that Trump's right. It has to change. Why shouldn't institutions reflect reality on the ground? This is something the elites don't like. Go ahead.
I think that's true. A lot of the rhetoric comes from senior officials, including Mark Stoltenberg, of course, heading NATO itself from Brussels. The threat is way overestimated and talked up.
The threat is open borders and terrorism. The threat isn't
Absolutely.
Russia to Europe, okay? It's bad decision-making made within the European Union. That's what the real threat is.
Yeah.
Part of the problem is that the primary purpose of NATO has never been defense of Europe. It's never been used defensively to defend, the Western countries. Article 5 has never been invoked against a state enemy. But that NATO's purpose has become the extension of Atlanticist Western hegemony around the world. And Trump has indicated that he's not necessarily that interested in that. And that's what threatens the NATO elites. In particular, I think we're looking at perhaps a titanic, at least temporary, political divide between Europe and the United States, similar to what we saw during the Bush years when we started talking about the U.S. as Mars and Europe as Venus, but to a much higher extent.
But don't you think that, at the end of the day, we can have the rhetoric coming out of Brussels, out of London, but they're going to they're basically going to fold, and they're going to follow what the United States does, even if they don't like it, Alex.
Well, if you look at NATO and if you look at these Western alliance, the United States is so overwhelmingly the most powerful part of it that the idea of a European confrontation with Russia continuing without the United States is impossible. It can't be done. and any idea of Angela Merkel leading the West.
Well, you know, but that brings up the issue of
yeah.
Ukraine here, because Trump has made it very clear,
Yeah.
or at least rhetorically, we don't know about policy yet, and we still don't have these people to talk about it. But he's not good. It appears that he won't be sending additional arms or more sophisticated arms to the regime in Kiev, which certainly is worrying Mr. Poroshenko quite a bit.
No, absolutely. I think one of the reason why I'm so optimistic is that I think that President-elect Trump won't prosecute the foreign wars and the undermining of overseas leaders that we have seen really for quite some years from the United States. Ukraine and the Crimean situation, where they voted to go with the Soviet Union,
Russia.
Indeed, the reason why is very, very simple, and I think that this is the reason why I'm so optimistic.
Okay, you're 20 seconds before we go to the break, Mark.
Yeah,
you disagree. Go ahead.
We have a potential for improvement in Ukraine, Syria, and the South China Sea. But at the same time, Trump's picks of people like Michael Flynn, possibly General Mattis, and Pompeo as head of the CIA indicate that he is going to be taking a much harder stance against what he calls radical Islam. But he includes the entire Islamic world.
Okay, we're going to continue this discussion when we get back from the break. After that break, we'll continue our discussion on Trump's foreign policy team. Stay with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing what we can expect from a Trump foreign policy. Okay, Mark, let me go back to you. We're talking about specific cases that could change under a Trump foreign policy.
Yeah, if we take a look at the figures that Trump has picked so far for his cabinet, a number of them are not necessarily ideological neocons, institutionalized ones, but are right-wing, often military hawks, often who in recent years have run afoul of the Obama administration, like Flynn, like Mattis, because of the stance on Islam and U.S. interference in the Islamic world. The problem I have with a lot of these people is they don't separate or differentiate differences in Islam. They lump all the countries together, and a lot of them are extremely hawkish on Iran, as well as, say, on Saudi Arabia. And while we might have a temporary improvement in relations if the U.S. ends its proxy war in Syria, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey might not. But if the Trump administration finds itself in a confrontational stance a year or two down the road with Iran, that puts us right back into a conflict situation in the Middle East.
Alex, let's talk about Syria, because that's another thing that we have some clarity when it comes to Trump and his foreign policy. He doesn't seem particularly interested in supporting those people because we don't know who they are. We know who they are, and I'm glad that he doesn't want to support them. They're terrorists. This would be a significant move here, and it was certainly with the elites right now. They want to see the war pursued. So, I mean, if we have somebody like a Bolton coming in, this would not be good. I mean, I can't imagine something like that would happen. It would be a disaster.
Don't say it.
Okay, don't even say it. Don't even say it. All right. But let's talk about a more nuanced Syria policy.
Well, if the United States changes its policy on Syria and takes the whole question of U.S. interference in Syria off the table, that will be a change. But the United States is not the only player in Syria.
That's the problem.
There is Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi foreign minister has already spoken out strongly against any deals with President Assad. And, of course, there's Turkey. And as Mark knows, I take a very dim view of Turkish policy in Syria. I think Turkey is still fully committed to regime change in Syria. And they will continue to supply people in Syria, jihadis in Syria, to fight the Syrian government. So,
well, the interesting thing is that we saw this under Obama, is that you have the regional players that don't have any particular belief, they don't trust the President of the United States, the current one right now, and with what we've heard from Donald Trump, they may feel exactly the same thing. Essentially, the U.S. has really diminished itself by its behavior in the region, and other people will take up the mantle there.
It started, in my opinion, the whole situation in Syria. It was the United States that began the process of regime change there. But now the other actors have moved in and they have their own agenda, which has not changed and which they will continue with.
You know, Matthew, one of the interesting things that Trump has said during the campaign and since his unbelievable election is that he wants the United States, and I think, and for other countries, to have much more of a economic foreign policy. He seems not to be enamored with forced regime change, the forced exporting of democracy and all other these so-called Western values. He's interested in building something. He's very interested in rebuilding American infrastructure and building jobs. The U.S. has the tools to do that internationally if it were to focus on that instead of these, and I will quote President Obama, stupid wars.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what the main reason that I'm optimistic about a Trump presidency, which, I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting. The total unnecessary requirement to intervene in other sovereign countries is something that we've almost grown used to.
Yes.
And it hasn't made the world a safer place. For all his rhetoric during the election campaign and getting himself to the White House, I think Donald Trump, if we could just sort of draw back from the people that he's surrounding himself with at the moment, actually could be a fairly pragmatic president and a sensible president, concentrating on his Senate.
Again, but if you watch the Western mainstream media, you won't see that, even if he is.
Absolutely.
You know, Mark, one of the interesting things here is that we had Brexit this year. We had the Trump victory, and we have a number of elections coming up in Europe. And part of the debate now is framed through nationalists or domesticists versus the globalists. Is this a real battle that's being played out right now? Because we see people in these electorates turning much more inward.
Yeah, I think there's a truth to it. And I think more it's a long-awaited backlash to what has become, both domestically as a postmodern liberal identity, focusing on identity politics, postmodern liberalism, but also on the international level, it comes out as they speak of a liberal international order that is Western hegemony. And we see a backlash on that, primarily in the terms of identity. Even Francis Fukuyama this week came out and reversing his
How many times does this guy get to reverse himself?
The end of history thesis. And we've seen discussion of an end of the end of history, a return of nationalism. I'm not so sure they necessarily refer to it as nationalism.
But people do, Alex, but people do. And this is considered very, very negative, again, by this very liberal agenda of the Atlantic world here, that if you think in terms of the nation, you are somehow retrograde. But the same mentality is afraid of democracy. It doesn't trust democracy. Exactly. You know, the EU will have as many votes as it needs to get the answer it wants. This is what I call the insurrection here, and I think it's extremely unfair to label it in such negative ways. Instead of labeling, why don't they try to understand it?
Well, they don't want to understand it because, of course, it threatens the entire post-liberal, post-modern project which we have seen being created and which is very artificial, because an awful lot of people are not buying it. They don't understand it. They don't relate to it at all. And most people, I am sure, most people who work in factories, in farms, they're not interested in expanding Western hegemony around the world. They don't want to see their sons and brothers. Well,
particularly if the infrastructure of their community is completely retrograde, and we're nation building abroad where people have social benefits the average American or average citizen of the UK does not have.
But of course, it is these people who are now voting against these policies who are being attacked because they're being said that they should be ashamed for voting in the way that they did. And we've seen a campaign in Britain to basically try and reverse Brexit, and we're seeing attempts in the United States to delegitimize Mr. Trump. and the people who.
But you know, the more that happens, and I'm going to Matthew, I think the more that emboldens people that have this. This feeling inside that the current status quo isn't working for them, and it is to the benefit of a very small number of people here. I mean, let's think of Europe in 2017. Is this wave going to continue, you think?
I think there's a strong possibility it will do. We've seen change in Austria. Who knows at the moment whether Angela Merkel is going to be re-elected?
We have Italy is also.
The players in Europe that Donald Trump may be dealing with during his presidency may change very considerably in a short period of time.
Mark, what's going to happen when Trump meets Merkel?
The relations are not going to get off to a good start. They already have not gotten off to a good start. Merkel, when meeting with Obama spoke kind of defensively against Trump when he was in Greece. He was speaking against this rise of nationalism, against this rise of tribalism. He was talking about both politics in the U.S. and in Europe, of course, because the phenomenon is the same. But when he came to Germany, Merkel specifically offered a continued cooperation with the United States.
So Merkel is agreeing to work with Trump. Is that what you're telling us?
Agreeing to work with Trump, but specifically on terms. She expressed a series of values focusing on gender, identity, sexuality, and these other things. First of all, it's condescending to suggest, of course, that he doesn't share these values. It sets things off to a very bad relationship between Germany and the United States. And we've got the entire Western press now proclaiming that Angela Merkel has been passed the baton of the liberal, the free,
well,
the leader of the free
Alex,
world.
let's say she's got the baton. How long is she going to hang on to it? Because I think her political career is coming rapidly to an end.
Well, not very long at all is the answer. If you ask me the question how long she's going to hold on to it, because Germany doesn't have that kind of strength. Merkel doesn't have that kind of strength. Her position in Germany is increasingly being questioned. And of course, with Merkel, it's partly the whole policies that she has followed over the last couple of years, which have boxed her in. She's not really in a position to shift from them because her authority is so bound up with them. So that is one reason why she is going to be antagonistic to Trump. But the idea
Can she afford to be antagonistic to Trump?
She's going to be antagonistic to Trump, but whether she can afford to be overtly his opponent, it's impossible.
Okay, Matthew, I'm going to give you the last question here.
Well,
but I want to ask you, the United States, the US and the UK traditionally have a special relationship. I don't know how special it is, but apparently, okay. How is that relationship going to change with the Trump presidency?
Well, I believe that Trump is going to force change on the United Kingdom, and I welcome that. David Cameron wasn't the slightest bit interested in foreign affairs.
His policies reflected it.
He was only interested to the extent that off the cuff he'd promised a referendum on our membership of the European Union, and
the biggest political mistake of a politician in the modern era.
Well, we now have a Prime Minister who is, having spent 6 long years as our Home Secretary, our Interior Minister, she's very worried about security issues. She's spent a lot of time on them in her previous job.
Well, then, we've run out of time. But remember what you've just said here. It seems to me that they should be able to work together. That's all the time we have, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests here in Moscow, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love it.